Structural racism is this system of hierarchy and inequity primarily characterized by white supremacy, the preferential treatment, privilege, and power for white people at the expense of Black, Latino, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American, and other racially oppressed people. Structural racism encompasses an entire system of white supremacy. It's the most profound and pervasive form of racism, and all other forms emerge from that. The institutional, the interpersonal, and let's not talk internalized. Our young people in schools internalize racism based on their experiences in the system and the messages they receive. Now you think about if you internalize negative messages about your group, the impact that has on your engagement in the curriculum and your performance in the classroom. So another question we have to ask ourselves is, what messages are our Black and brown youth internalizing in these learning spaces that are inherently racially hostile? Okay. Now, let me define institutional racism, because sometimes people are like, well, I don't really understand the difference between structural and institutional. Institutional racism is discriminatory treatment, usually manifested through unfair policies. Think about that, policies, because I'm going to talk about ed policy. And inequitable opportunities and impacts based on race, okay? Produced and perpetuated by institutions. So schooling, again, is just one institution in our society, and racism perpetuates itself in the institution through ed policy. And we'll talk about some examples, right? Because I want you to think about how those policies play out in Flint and negatively, disproportionately negatively affect Black and brown youth in Flint. Okay? But when you begin to think about institutional racism, I want you to always think about policies that when they're implemented, disproportionately negatively affect marginalized groups that are already marginalized. And so then the policy implementation further marginalizes them. All right? And then cultural racism is like cultural imperialism in school. It's the universalization of a dominant group's experience, culture, their way of life. All right? It's the norm. The best example I can think of in education historically is sending indigenous people to the boarding schools. Oh, this is going to be your better way of life, right? Our government said, we're going to send you off to these boarding schools. You'll get educated. And it was basically a project of cultural imperialism. We got to cut their hair so they can look more like you. You can't speak your language. We need you to dress. I mean, if you can go on YouTube and just find the narratives. Indigenous people's mouths being washed out with soap if they spoke their native tongue in those boarding schools. This happened on this land, which is Native people's land. I mean, now that's deep. You want to talk about structural racism manifesting in a cultural way, that is deep, right? So, people don't want to talk about the history of racism in this country. It's not just a Black and white issue. It's white folks and people of color, Black, Latino, I hate to say it's white folks and people of color, right? But again, functioning, it's middle and upper class versus low income, right? It's men versus women. If we think about any dominant category, that's the cultural norm that has been imposed on everyone. and it's a white supremacist cultural norm. So now if you feel like, okay, in my mind, I think I understand structural, which is the big umbrella, but it manifests in institutions, it manifests in cultural forms, and it manifests at the individual level, right? Then that helps you understand the other things I'm going to talk about. So now let's talk about critical race theory. Critical race theory is a theory that actually started out in law, in critical legal studies. And sometime in the 90s, education folks said, oh, this helps us talk about racism in education. We need to adapt this theory. This happens all the time in disciplines. And so when you think about that, critical race theory is actually still in its infancy in education, but it's been, how many of you have heard of Derek Bell, the law professor? I mean, he is the father of the grandfather of critical race theory, but he was a law professor. If you remember early on in President Obama's first term, people said, he's too aligned with Derek Bell. Obama is a racist because Derek Bell is a racist. And I consider myself to be a critical race theorist, and oftentimes people think, we believe in some kind of conspiracy theory or something. No, we just know that racism is the very fabric of this country. And if you don't want to name that and talk about it, you have an issue, right? Your reality is morphed. And so Derek Bell, legal scholar, along with some others, kind of founded critical race theory in critical legal studies. Education scholars got a hold of it and said, whoa, this helps us understand educational inequities, and let's use it. So I'm going to give you some tenets of critical race theory. Like if somebody said, what is that theory? You could say, well, look, it's premised on this. The first one, critical race theory says racism is endemic to U.S. society. It's a normal fact of daily life. It has never gone away, and racial realists say it never will. That we will continually be in a project of trying to eradicate racism, but that we never will be able to. That's a racial realist. There are racial idealists who believe, yes, we can do it someday. And so I want you to think about where you are in that camp. Derek Bell was a racial realist. He didn't believe we could ever really eradicate racism, but that we'd always be working in the project to do it, right? You can't give up, but you can keep working to dismantle it. So that's the first tenet. It's a normal fact of daily life in U.S. society that the assumptions of white superiority are so ingrained in the political, legal, and educational structures that they're almost unrecognizable, right? Sometimes Beverly Daniel Tatum, former president of Spelman, an educational psychologist, said racism is the smog in the air. We don't even know we're breathing it. It's so normalized, and we all take part in it, either actively or passively, right? So think about that. The next tenet is called interest convergence. So Derek Bell believed that the interest of particularly blacks in gaining racial equality in the U.S. are only accommodated when whites see benefit. That's called interest convergence. And I want you to think about how that might happen in education, that there are gains made for people of color only when the dominant group sees that it's a gain for them. Otherwise, we're going to slow this train down. If we can't see a benefit for us, we're not going to help those who are subordinate to us. Think about that. When we think about, well, let me get through the tenets and then I'll go back. Okay? That's the next one. Another tenet of CRT is that it is important to illuminate the voices of marginalized people. We don't hear the narratives of people of color enough. We don't hear the narratives of you. We talk about what's better for kids of color in schools. We don't ask them. We need to do more talking with them to understand their lived experiences and how we can best accommodate them. See, by nature as adults, we just think we know what's best. So one of the things I forgot to say about my research, I'm very committed to student voice. If you Google me and look up my journal articles, most of my work includes student voice. I interview young people because I want to know how they understand racism imposed upon them. I don't want to make assumptions about it. I need to ask them, right? So I'm very committed to research that illuminates voices of marginalized youth, whether that's by race, by socioeconomic status, by gender, by some intersection of those, right? And we'll talk about that as well. Another tenet of CRT, I'm not sure why my mind is blanking, is intersectionality. So while critical race theorists center race in understanding educational inequity, they also understand that race intersects with other identity markers. So what are the experiences of Latino males in our schools? What are the experiences of LGBT youth of color in our schools? See how the intersection of those identities. So CRT says, yeah, we believe race should be centered, and it also is, we should examine those inequities in conjunction with socioeconomic inequities and other things, gender, sexuality, etc. Okay. The other thing that CRT, another tenet of CRT, excuse me, is anti-essentialism. So we have to move away from saying, well, all black boys, ... as if that is a monolithic group with the same lived experiences. We have to understand that that's dangerous territory when we say, here are the teaching strategies for black boys. Well, there are different kinds of black boys, right? Now, there may be some fundamental strategies that are good, but you got to be careful about saying, here's a package and let's put it in every school for black boys. That's essentializing. And we shouldn't essentialize it. We shouldn't essentialize white folks. White folks are a very diverse group. Again, we're talking about a system of oppression. The participants in the system are diverse. The system is what has maintained itself over time. Do you see what I'm saying? We all participate in the system. You just got to decide how you're going to participate. Are you an oppressor, or are you someone who's empowering others and fighting the oppression? So now that I've given you the tenets of CRT, I want to go back and talk about, or some of the tenets of CRT, and talk about how racism manifests specifically in education according to these tenets. The first thing we can look at an institutional, well, let me go back to structural, is racial segregation in public schools, right? So much of the research says our schools are actually more segregated now than 40 or 50 years ago. So Brown versus Board of Education Derek Bell and critical race theorists would argue was nothing but a matter of interest convergence. That the nation actually did not want to desegregate the schools, but we were in the time of the Cold War, and other nations were looking at us, and it was a good thing to do for our national image, and oh, it'll pacify the blacks. That's interest convergence, right? And the project itself, there's a difference between desegregating schools and integrating them. I want to say that again. There's a difference between racially desegregating school spaces and achieving integration. And the project of integration, many would argue, has never been realized in education, right? That just putting racially diverse kids together doesn't achieve integration. It might desegregate the space, but there's a lot more work involved in achieving integration. And so we've never achieved integration, and now we're back to racially desegregated schools. And what has led to that? A continual project of structural racism that's located in the historical, the economical, the cultural. Do you see what I'm saying? And the institution of education has just perpetuated it through these policies that we think are great at one point in time, then we switch to another policy, that kind of thing. Okay? So I'll talk, but I wanted you to understand racial segregation as not just institutional, but something structural happening in education. That we're returning to Plessy versus Ferguson. And what is the impact of that for schools? Now, some would say, well, before Brown versus Board, black kids weren't going to school with white kids, and black teachers were teaching them, and they were doing just fine. So there are some who would say we don't need to try to racially desegregate these schools. But what we see happening is that schools that are majority black and Latino are underfunded, under-resourced. They have lower quality teachers. See, those are functions of institutional racism. Why is it that those schools cannot be equally funded, equally resourced, have high quality teachers as the school in Bloomfield Hills, or wherever we are in the state that's upper income? So we have to ask those questions. So now let me move to underfunding in U.S. schools, right? And how that gets perpetuated. So critical race theorists would say school funding is a function of institutional racism. Inequity in school funding underscores the function of racism prominently in schools. It is a function of institutional and structural racism, the inability specifically of African Americans and Latinos to qualify for educational advancements, for jobs, for mortgages. See, now I'm trying to get you to think about the other institutions. That creates a cycle of low educational achievement, of underemployment and unemployment. So we don't just have issues of unemployment, people of color are underemployed, right, for what their credentials are. And substandard housing is a function of that. If I'm unemployed or underemployed, if I lack educational advancement, that can have a generational effect in my family, hence determine where I live, hence determine the quality of the school for my children. Do you see how it's a domino effect? So we can't, in a lot of ways, we can't fix institutional racism in schools in a silo. we actually have to simultaneously be working on institutional and structural racism in these other institutions: housing, healthcare, the workforce. And part of the problem, I think, is we've worked too long trying to fix educational problems in a vacuum. Can't do it, because all these institutions are connected, right? But we just expect schools to fix the problems, and that can't happen. And so the school funding issue, how many of you know, this is not necessarily the case fully in Michigan, but generally in the U.S., schools are funded by property taxes. Did you know that? Right? And so it's why within a 3-mile radius, you could have a school where there are roaches and the ceiling is cracked. And you just go 3 miles down the street and you have this Taj Mahal building. It's because schools are funded primarily based on property taxes. And unfortunately, when we have white flight in neighborhoods, what happens to the schools? They go down. When the white people move out, it's like the economic capital leaves the neighborhood, right? I think about the neighborhood I grew up in. I grew up in the suburbs. I'm not a product of urban schools. In fact, I told you about the busing thing. So I went to predominantly white schools, pretty much most of K-12, but we lived in a racially integrated neighborhood. But you go now, that neighborhood is predominantly black. They have some Section 8 housing. I mean, that would have never been the case when we, back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. How does that happen? How is it that a pattern of white flight changes the dynamics of the community in terms of economic and social and cultural capital? Those are other questions we have to ask ourselves. And then that changes that now we don't have neighborhood schools, right? Because the neighborhood school has to shut down. It's inadequate. I mean, I went to neighborhood schools before we started the busing. My children go to a neighborhood school in East Lansing. We walk to school. I don't have to drive them, right? But if all those white people start moving out of that neighborhood, I bet you the dynamics will change. Why does that happen?